on today's StoryBeat.
First of all, dream big and be bold. Don't be afraid to try new things and don't be afraid to fail. Everything is not going to be perfect. But when you get in that stride and you get in that rhythm, you can hear that beat and you can dance.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Lady Dhyana Ziegler, is currently president and CEO of Z Creators LLC and professor emerita of Florida A&M University. She's worked in the field of higher education and technology for more than 35 years as a professor and administrator. Dr. Ziegler is the author of 4 books, more than 60 scholarly publications, including book chapters, and has produced more than 100 videos and other multimedia works. She most recently published Midnight Train from Georgia, which chronicles and celebrates the extraordinary life of William Franklin Guest, one of the founding members of the famed singing group Gladys Knight and the Pips. I've read Midnight Train from Georgia and can tell you it's a fascinating study of an artist working inside the rough and tumble world of show business at the highest level. For those listeners who may not know, Gladys Knight and the Pips released numerous popular smash hit songs like Midnight Train to Georgia, I've Got to Use My Imagination, Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me, and many more. Lady Dhyana is also a multimedia writer, digital content producer, and songwriter. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the outstanding educator and author, Lady Dhyana Ziegler, to StoryBeat today. Lady Dhyana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Steve, for inviting me.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Believe me, I'm so happy to have you here. So let's go back in time just a little bit. How old were you when you first started thinking about being a scholar and an educator?
Well, it's so funny because my root was not to be an educator. I really thought that I was going to help save the world through music. I was inspired by music. My father was the lead singer of the Morning Doves Gospel Quartet. And my brother-in-law that you mentioned, William Franklin Guest, was in my life since I was 11 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So while my sister and I basically, as when I was a young child, we were dancers in the neighborhood. So we studied, interpretive dance. I studied a little tap and ballet. I went to a little Catholic school, Resurrection. We put on performances every year. We had to dance and sing. So by the time we got involved with Gladys Knight and the Pips, I was already introduced a little bit to entertainment. So I
Mm-hmm.
really thought that I was going to be an entertainer.
Did you sing also?
I actually had 2 bands, and my last one, Time and Space. But I also wrote and produced a #1 disco song in 1975, Time Moves On, by the group Strut. And
Okay.
I was a double major music. So yeah, I did a little bit of all of that. I sang, I sang in a choir. In fact, I was just telling my some of my grammar school classmates, I'm just coming back from New York celebrating my birthday, that I've been telling people that the reason I probably sing so high is because of Catholicism, because they had me as a soprano. And if you think about the masses and everything, they're usually in a very high key. So that's how, I was gotten involved with music and a little singing.
So how did all of that upbringing of being surrounded by music, musicians, performers, and so on, how do you think that that then eventually impacted what you did as an educator? Because I want to get to both sides of your disciplines.
It is because of music and entertainment. It's like what I tell my students when I stopped telling them that I was teaching them news or journalism. I told them I was teaching them how to package information. So the transition, to entertainment, or in my particular field, which was journalism and broadcasting, music and all of that and rhythm was just a part of that. So anything that I did, on the radio or on television always had some kind of musical rug. I never separated those entities. I think about them all together in a package. You just sort of change the bowl.
That's very interesting. So you've also been for quite some time also a storyteller. And in the entertainment industry, what you're doing as a songwriter, a singer, and so on, you're also telling stories. So have you always thought of yourself as a storyteller?
Yes, I mean, it was more as a survival mechanism. I mean,
In what way?
people will not believe that I really didn't even talk much until I was 19 years old. I basically wrote everybody letters. I mean, my sister and everybody was older than me. I was in Catholic school where you had to be silent and you really learned how to write. And so all of that combined with me being in my mind, I spent a lot of time in my mind, trying to figure out things. In fact, they thought I was a little strange growing up. And because I wouldn't really just sleep. I was one of those kids who rocked a little bit, and I was always trying to figure out the universe and what was going on. So that took me into actually poetry. But my mother will tell you, don't go to sleep on this child, because at 7 years old, you would have a letter waiting for you by your coffee if she thought that she was mistreated or something. So I would write letters and leave it by, I knew when my mother was going to sit and drink coffee. And, if I thought that she raised her voice or she was, asking me to do something that my older sister and brother didn't have to do, I had to get it out. So I just wrote, and then the writing evolved into poetry. And then I bought a guitar and started putting music to these poems or lyrics. And in fact, to the point where I used to do this all day long and sometimes even fall asleep, with the guitar, just playing because it was soothing to me. So I guess it was almost like the rocking.
So I'm fascinated by two things that you've talked about here. One is the writing part of it, which you started obviously at a very young age.
Yes.
And you were learning this in school, I assume, and then on your own as well. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, as in Catholic school, writing was a big thing. Plus, if you talked in school or anything, you had to write 100 times. I will not talk. So, all of, sort of the discipline of Catholicism that we're all kind of, rebellious about now really helped crafted my art. I learned early that words were powerful. My mother did not really kind of scold me about that. In fact, she thought it was a little bit humorous
Hmm.
that I would do this because, my brother and sister, they were 4, 5, and 6 years older than me. So I could not whip anybody, so everybody was always saying to be quiet. They didn't really want to be bothered with a little sister, who was always having to run to even keep up with them because they walked so fast. So I found that as an outlet of expression early. I did not necessarily know what I was doing or where it was going to lead me, but I knew that whatever it was, I had to get it out.
Do you think being around all these songwriters and people who sung and listening to lots of music, and then also the Bible and being in Catholic school and so on, do you think that that's where the lyricism came from in the poetry that you eventually turned to?
Well, let me just say, by the time I got to Catholicism, that was my third baptism.
Okay.
When I was born, I was baptized Methodist. Then my parents sent me, before I could go to school, to Florida for a couple of years to live with my grandparents until I was old enough to go to school. But somehow down there, and we still don't know how I developed my brain, but I got skipped twice. So when I was came back to New York, I was going to the fourth grade when I should have been going to the second. So I ended up in Catholic school on a fluke because my mother had one day off work. Public school would not take me. They said I was too small. And my mother had that one day off of work, so she had to get me in school. So she took me over to Father Dugan because my sister and brother had decided they wanted to be Catholic. Now, my grandparents, which I left out, they baptized me Baptist when I was down in Florida with them.
Wow.
And then when I came back, my sister and brother's friends were Catholic, and then my mother turned Catholic. So she took me over to Father Dugan, and he said, well, we'll take her, but she's too small to go in the fourth, so we'll put her in the third. I always contend I could have started wherever, but that's how I ended up at least one grade ahead. But yes, all of the music, because the music I learned in the South, that gospel music was very, very heavy. But then I get back to New York and Catholicism, you're almost complete silence, because everything was so quiet. But my father was still singing gospel.
But the words are lyrical all the way through what you're talking about from all these different, whether it's a Methodist or Baptist or Catholicism, all of it's lyrical.
Right, lyrical, coupled with the fact that my mother, especially, and my father, but my mother especially, loved the Apollo Theater and Wednesday night. So as a little kid, I was going to the Apollo. We always sat in the right box seat.
How old?
I would say probably about 9. When I was
Okay.
12, my sister and I won the twist contest
Really?
at the Apollo. She won for the older, I won for the younger, and we're
Wow.
like 4 years apart. So, and they played music in the house. They played those 45s. We danced. They would probably call my parents, that abusive because they used to, if they come home and they wanted to play music, they would wake us up to dance and we would have fun dancing and playing music. So that was just a part of my life.
It had to have been part of your life if you were you couldn't help it. It was all around you
Right,
at
that's
all
right.
times. Uh, do you think that you were starting to conjure in your mind's eye how to create stories and words and music and lyrics and so on because you were surrounded by all that? That's what I'm trying to get at is where does this influence come from in what you turned out eventually?
I think that a lot of that had definitely had something to do with it. But
Hmm.
also, sort of rebelled in the 60s the way everybody else did
Sure.
in my generation. And I was looking for something else. I was questioning Catholicism. My mother had to come to school because they said everybody who wasn't Catholic would go to hell. And I started screaming that my grandmother wasn't going to hell. She's Baptist. And so my mother basically told them, look, I'm not going to have her believe that because she has members of a family that are other faiths. And then she told me, do not, just be quiet about this. So I had to learn, and the fact that I wasn't, like I said, talking that much and writing letters, I didn't start the poetry and stuff until sort of the 60s. And that's a story in itself that I don't even talk about much, but I actually ended up going to Jamaica about age 18, 19, and I was supposed to be there on a 2-week vacation. By that time, I knew some people in the business, but I loved Jamaica so much, and I ended up deciding I didn't want to come back right away. So I managed a guest house. But because I knew entertainers, and I knew Johnny Nash, and I knew his manager and stuff, I moved his arranger and the wife in the house. I had a editor of a magazine in the house. So I built this house of entertainers that I knew to run this guest house. And throughout that, I was also exposed a lot to Johnny Nash's music, Byron Lee and the Dragoneers. And that's where I bought my first guitar
In Jamaica.
in Jamaica.
Did you start to not only play the guitar, but did you start to write as at the same
Yeah,
time
that's
music?
when I started writing and playing. In fact, it's so funny because when I left, I had a whole different persona. I was a model. My family were all dressers, but I used to do some modeling and stuff. When I came back, I had jeans, a big old afro, and a guitar. They didn't even recognize me coming through customs. So, I mean, my mother just like kind of stared at me for 3 days because she did not know. And to me, I thought this did not make any sense. I said, well, here my sister, by this time, my sister is dating William. Like we've been exposed to, entertainment. In fact, no, they had been married because I went there around just about that time. And so I just thought that this would be great that here her child is going to be in music and follow the same footsteps. Well, no, she did not want me in music or anything. In her mind, I had a brain. She paid for me to go to school. I need to use it. So I rebelled against that. I kept writing anyway.
You were undaunted by that.
Right, right. So I just, continued. Of course, after a while, I had to move out of the house because I was going, my own way. But then by that time, too, Gladys Knight and the Pips started really blowing up. And I spent a few years because, my brother-in-law, like ever since I was 11 years old, we were just close. And I ended up being the executive vice president of Patton and Guest Productions, which was
Okay.
Edward Patton and William Guest. And besides the music, I created a product, Disco Bells, in 1975 that we put out that was in Cosmopolitan and Essence. And
What are disco bells?
disco bells that you wear on your wrist. It was jewelry, artistic jewelry. We produced a song, put on your dancing bell. So I produced a couple of songs and wrote a couple of songs on the Willie Bridges album. They produced Willie Bridges, who was a saxophone player. And at the same time, I wrote my song, Time Moves on Brunswick by the group Strut and co-produced the album.
So how did you know how to produce? Had you been around production enough to know?
Oh yeah. I was in the studios with my brother-in-law, and then I was blessed to also be around arrangers. I lived in 82nd Street between Central Park West and Columbus. Nick and Valerie Simpson, they lived on 79th Street. Benny Clark lived here. Mickey Bass, who was a bass player, who always thought I should play bass, lived a block away. So it was all these artists around. Miles Davis lived on 84th Street when I lived on 85th Street. So, that was just a time of music. I studied at Jazzmobile. I went and learned percussion from Jazzmobile, and Ted Dunbar studied a little guitar. I went totally in the areas of the arts because that's where I wanted to be. And due to the fact of my brother-in-law being a Pip and being around all of these entertainers and them discovering I had talent because I was a lyricist, I would write an album overnight if I had stay up all night and write. I mean, even to this day, lyrics or even people laugh, but writing theses and dissertations were not hard. Everything has a methodology. I just learned the method. But what made me happy?
Did you know early on as a young woman, did you know that you were good at it? Did you have that kind of confidence?
I mean, yeah, because my song went number one. And also my brother-in-law, they would listen, not and they would listen to the music, and we listened to a lot of music with young artists, new songwriters and stuff like that. And they would say, "Oh, that's a hit. Well, this is a hit."
Wow.
And the people that was around, they sort of embraced the fact, that I could write quickly, and I had, a feel. I could play the chords and stuff. I wasn't the arranger. Benny Clark arranged the Strut album Time Moves On, but I was a double major. So besides journalism, I majored in music. So I love strings. And Time Moves On, if you ever listen to it, oh, the strings in it are fantastic. That's when music was really pure. And so being around these arrangers and going to these studios, I mean, we were recording music when the first 24 track studio came out. Things were so different, but that was big, in the 70s to have a 24 track studio. Now, there's so many tracks there. It's not as pure.
Well, you're talking about back in the day when everything was recorded on tape. Now it's all digital, right?
Yes, when it was recorded on tape, not
Indeed,
digital. I
indeed.
mean, the young folks don't even hardly know anything.
No, of
Even when
course not.
yeah, even when in the book where they talk about Garfield having the little hand carried record player, they don't know anything about that. They stream everything.
Mhm.
But there was a time you had to put things down, and then it would drop down, and then the needle would come over.
So, who were your musical influences that got you to write the kinds of material that you wrote? Who did you wish to emulate or be?
Well, I didn't wish to be anybody, but when people and I just got a compliment because I'm still writing some music, and someone said to me, "Your music is like folk. It sounds like Bob Dylan." And I said, "Oh, thank you very much."
That's a good compliment.
But yeah, it's a real compliment. But I think that I learned folk guitar. I learned how to play folk guitar. So what I could take that because I've taken the same kind of music and then handed it over to an arranger who would keep that melody but make the music sound differently.
Hmm. So you're writing something underneath. This is interesting. You're writing something that is perhaps based on a folk thought or a folk sound, but you're altering it to be in a different sound entirely then, yes?
Right, and that's because I've always sort of written messages. I mean, Time Moves On was like a fly, robin, fly back in the day, but I think about you. It's moving on, but I think about you, which is a hook in there, which sort of tells a story, and then the music does a lot. But for Willie Bridges, when my true love comes along, I remember Willie, he's a saxophone player. He's deceased now, but he loves that, sort of like we'll be walking hand in hand through the park, hanging out like teenage lovers after dark. I mean, I used to go to Central Park with my guitar, get on top of a rock, and just sing to people, walking by, because that was, again, it goes back to that little girl. The music and all of that stuff was very, very soothing to me. And the thing was that, even now to this day, I will still write, or I even rock sometimes.
Let's talk for a moment about the book, about Midnight Train from Georgia. Tell the listeners what the book really focuses on. I mentioned a little bit, but give us a little more about what the book is about.
Okay, well, first of all, Midnight Train from Georgia, the reason it's titled Midnight Train from Georgia, not only taken off on the song Midnight Train to Georgia, but the fact they left Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
The book tells the story of the beginning of the Pips, and people know them as Gladys Knight and the Pips, but they were originally the Pips. My brother-in-law will say that he was singing and dancing in the womb because of his grandparents and parents singing on the back porch when he was in the belly as well as a little young boy, where all the neighborhood would come around and hear them singing. Mama Tilly, the grandmother, singing, Uncle playing the guitar, and so on and so forth. And he learned harmony in the kitchen with his grandmother when she was cooking.
Fantastic.
She taught him harmony. Now, the original Pips were Gladys Knight, her brother Merrill Bubba Knight, her sister Brenda Knight, my brother-in-law William Franklin Guest, and his sister Eleanor Guest. That was the Pips. William would contain that was the best singing group. So it tells the story from them as little kids growing up in a Mount Moriah Baptist church in Atlanta, Georgia, in the youth choir while their parents were in the adult choir. And they were singing, but how they became sort of a pop group is because of Bubba's 10th birthday party. And little Garfield came over with his little record player, and they were spinning 45s, but Garfield had to go home early. So they just decided that they would start singing, and they started singing pop songs. And the parents listened and said, wow, these kids sound great together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how they started. So then they started singing around Atlanta, and then people started asking for them to sing. And to show you the talent of them, because all of them had talent. Even in the 3rd grade when my brother-in-law went to school, a teacher just gave him a horn. He started playing it. Gave Eleanor, his sister, a clarinet.
No training.
No training.
Wow.
He would make, and there's stories in there how they made up beats and classes and stuff like that. So as a result of them getting together as a group, as many of the groups were ripped off, they had their experience with someone kind of trying to rip them off early when they were teenagers, invited them over to just record some music. Next thing they know, they're walking down the street and their song, Every Beat of My Heart's playing on the radio, that the guy didn't have permission. So this is the story of how they became Gladys Knight and the Pips. That song, however, though, got the attention of Bobby Robinson in New York, who got in touch with a DJ to find these kids, found them, brought them up to New York, and re-recorded that song. And to distinguish between the two, they named one Gladys Knight and the Pips, and the other one the Pips. So that's how the group became known. They decided to go because all of them were lead singers.
The book really focuses mainly on William, though, correct?
Yes, yes.
And so why did you think this was the right time to publish a book about him?
Well, he passed in 2015, and he wanted his legacy, he wanted his story to be told and shared. He wanted young people to learn about the business. He wanted them to not make some of the same mistakes that he made, coming up, even with all of, all the temptations of the business that are out there that comes with the entertainment business, that still comes with the entertainment business.
100% true.
So he wanted to tell his story. And I mean, he was a good spiritual man. I mean, the fact that even though my sister and him divorced, they were together till his death, to the last breath. And that's how we all became one family, the Ziegler, the Knight, and the Guest family. So I grew up, I lived the story since I was 11 years old. I listened to all of the stories. I watched them grow. I watched them blossom. And I videotaped him for years.
Did you keep journals about all this too? Did you write this down?
No, I did it on video.
On video.
Yeah, I videotaped an interview. I mean, in the middle of the night, when nothing was going on, when we were just like talking, when the family was talking, when his grandmother was talking, all of that. So I'm a journalist, so I always had a video camera with me. So I captured moments for years, and especially maybe the last 7 years before his death. because that was the thing, because he would tell some stories over and over again. So trying to, it was almost like a patch quilt. I had to put all of this stuff together, and I had to actually transcribe them all. It was not, a quick process. Transcribe them all, get the parts that fit with this and fit with that, put them all together. It was one of the serious editing jobs I've ever done in my life that took a long time to do.
What was your process then? You have all this material. Where did you begin that process and how did you proceed to put it together? What was your process?
Well, I first started transcribing the tapes. Remember, I'm a journalist and I'm a producer, I'm in broadcasting. So, but I'm in news. So, news is quick. I would have to have my story together while I was in the car writing.
Yes.
So, yeah, but so this was different. I would have to take, and sometimes, and I'm a person that writes, I don't write chronologically. Sometimes I write topically. Sometimes I write from the end to the beginning and the middle.
Okay.
I mean, and I did that with my thesis and my dissertation. It depends on how my mind captures it and sees it. And it's something that, that I just know where it's going to go. What helped me in this story is the fact that I lived it. I had to then create that bridge, with the stories that he told, the stories my Margaret told. Eleanor, her sister, had passed, but the things that I'd heard about them, even in high school and all of that, and put that together. So dealing with this became a process of almost topical and chronological, because I had to deal with the chronology of the early years, his foundation. That was important. But it became topical when they moved from Georgia and then, from New York to Charlie Atkins, who was a famous tap dancer with Honey Coles, like getting them Marguerite Mays, because when Bobby Robinson ripped them off a lot, where they didn't make any money, but that was the way the business was back in the 50s and 60s. They really did not make any money.
And it still is to a certain extent.
Yeah, and and they did not know. They would say, "Oh, well, all those suits you have and this transportation that costs money, so you don't have any royalties." They learned later, and I learned from them.
So they had to learn the business through the streets. They had to learn it by doing
Yes.
it, not in school anyway, right?
Right, but they were blessed when they met Marguerite Mays, who was the former wife of the baseball player Willie Mays, but she was also married to one of the ink spots back in the day. So she knew music, and she took them sort of out of Harlem, away from all of that, because she said the street life, the hustling life, and she took them out to the island, got them in touch with Charlie Atkins, who worked with them. And a lot of people don't know that Charlie Atkins went to Motown Records. By the time Barry Gordy wanted Gladys Knight and the Pips, Charlie Atkins said, "Well, I'll come and teach like the Temps and the Four Tops and all of that, the rhythm," because he started with them with just a tin can, just hitting on a tin can with rhythm. So that's why the precision of the Pip steps are the way they were, very, very precise, because of Charlie Atkins and that tap dancing and that rhythmic.
He gave them their style in a sense. Is that
Yes,
true?
he did. Yeah, that's why the chapter of him is called Polishing Up Their Act, because Marguerite Mays found him. He was part of the copacetics and knew about the copacetics. That was sort of a group of, great artists, dancers and singers and stuff, and found him. And he decided that he would teach them. By the time Barry Gordy discovered them, he said he would go, but he would have to continue to work with the Pips. But he helped those other groups, the same thing. But, it was the Pips that really got that foundation from him.
So even though you grew up with William and these folks, did you learn anything through the process that you didn't previously know? Was there any kind of revelation or surprise that you found?
Oh, just how nasty the business is, you know. But one of the things, my brother-in-law, he would take us to we could be backstage or we could be at the Waldorf, but he never wanted us to be around if he were not present. Like he would say to me, because he knew that we knew a lot of entertainers, because he knew a lot of the stuff that was going on behind with the womanizing, the drugs, and all of that. He would never, and he would always say, "No, you're not going to go backstage, or don't go into this without me." He was very protective, of the family. Even though we were exposed and we would laugh and stuff, he would make sure that wherever his family would make sure that we were protected and away from all of that. So by the time I got into music, even though I watched my Time Moves On album at Brunswick Record go out the door and buy boxes that weren't going to stores that I was not going to get any royalties from,
Of
because
course.
that was the nature of the business. So I learned the dirty side of the business. But as an artist, I was just happy that my music was playing, on the radio, because that was the way it was. You were just out there. So
Well, that was a big deal, wasn't it, to get your
it,
stuff
it
out
was
on
a
the radio?
big deal, and to be number one in record world. I mean, you would think so. Like somebody asked me, "You still getting royalties?" I probably have to go out and a lawyer and find them way back in the day. But you just accept it. Oh, this was the business. They go out the door. Backdoor sales was part of it.
So one of the things that you rarely get taught in a school or a college, a university, wherever, that is even focused on the arts in any way, whether it's music or cinema or whatever it might be, theater, you rarely get taught the business end of the business. And so this is what you're talking about, is that you were sort of learning it by experiencing it. And sometimes that means there were negative consequences.
Negative consequences, and just the streets of the business, because a lot of deals were made, just in the streets, early on. I mean, even if it is where they're gonna stay, and listening to my brother-in-law's stories of having, when they were young, having to ride through the South. Remember, I grew up in New York City, so I always say that walked my reality from the rest of the world, because we learned socialization on the subway. I grew up with all cultures. I still have a hard time in environments that are just black and white. I mean, I just came home from New York. I was just so happy to be in, like a global place.
The great melting pot.
Yeah, the great melting pot. And, they grew up differently, but an experience of riding those buses through the South, or those cars. I mean, William tells a story about one time they were stopped by the police, and they were on their way to a gig, and they would not let them, they were late too, and they just held them up. They made them sing. They had to just
Oh,
sing for
wow.
them, just for the heck of it. I learned about humiliation and stuff that I was not exposed to growing up in New York, just from, where they had to stay, and various things that, are not the experiences of a lot of entertainers today. So, but that was the times.
What do you think made Gladys Knight and the Pips special, unique?
First of all, they were good, but their foundation was built on faith, love, family, and harmony. And I say harmony is more than the blending of voices, it was the blending
Mhm.
of spirit. They did everything together. They voted, they split everything down four ways, and they stayed together 37 years. And that is only because of faith, family, love, etc. And they laughed a lot. I mean, there was nothing more special than being with them or in the road or in the hotel room, listening to all the laughter and the stories. I mean, that was really so special, to me.
It would be torture if you had to go 37 years and you were at each other's throats. That would be horrible.
Right. But, you had that sultry sound of Gladys, but the Pips were more than a background. Their background could have been the lyric, because everybody could sing with them. Their background was lyrical. So putting that together, it wasn't just, if that Pip sound is missing, it's not Gladys Knight and the Pips.
What do you think made that sound? Was it just because they grew up together? What was it that made that so incredibly wonderful to listen to?
Well, yeah, because they sang together for so many years, but also, like you mentioned the imagination, Jim Weatherby. I mean, that the producers were good too, but they did not make the background. They made the background front ground. And that, I think, is important. And
That is important.
everybody knows that song and could sing along with it.
I think you just hit the key, is that the background was not just a background.
Right.
It was equal to or a part of. And then you
That's
had
right.
Gladys, I think, sort of making that special little above, just barely above them. But the Pips
Right.
were amazing.
That's right. And, and that's why that story was, important. I mean, the whole group, but when they understand of how they started as the Pips and, how they got to be Gladys Knight and the Pips, and then how they moved that harmony of spirit into that singing and that dancing, I think, well, I don't think, I know that when they separated, that was always painful, even though they were together 37 years. But, well, a couple of years or so prior to, they broke up in 89, got inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 96. Now, that in itself is special. Dionne Warwick just got in a year ago. Dionne came up with them. I see some other people who are just getting in, and I'm saying, wow, that really is another testament of how powerful they were and how special they were, because they got in and inducted early. And by 1996, Edward, had become ill and he was in a wheelchair. So eventually they would have had to separate, but all of the groups or the voices they put behind Gladys, it is not the Pips.
Well, the music is still played a lot, and it's very
Right.
familiar in the world. I think probably some young audiences may not recognize this is who that is. They hear the music, but they may not recognize it as Gladys Knight and the Pips. But it's out there. It's still pervasive. It's all over.
I mean, they recognize Midnight Train to Georgia, but I was
Yes,
at the
very much.
airport about 3 weeks ago, and I'm sitting in the airport getting ready to fly to Phoenix, and I hear "Save the Overtime for Me." That's a song that many people are familiar with, and
Yeah.
I was listening, and I said, "Wow, that's Save the Overtime" in the airport. So their music lives on and will live on.
And not everybody from that era has their music playing on and on. Some of them are
No,
gone.
that's what I'm saying. Some of them are gone. What made them stand out in Motown, just like the Temps or the Jackson 5 and all of that, they were good. They had a special sound, that will, as you say, continue to live on.
Was there any material that you weren't able to find or get anyone to tell you about that you wish you had?
No, because there may have been a couple of songs that were not recorded, and we still have access to my brother-in-law's music because he was still writing and singing, until his death. So we still have access to that. Don't know exactly if we would have somebody record that in the future and stuff. We have a tendency, the family, when we get together, Christmas or whenever I go up there, that we start singing some of the songs. Because he was just a character. And then when he would start stomping that foot and singing, so sometimes we'll start, joking. I mean, we keep his spirit is very much alive in us.
What do you think is your favorite moment from the book?
Oh, but I mean, I live so many moments in that book. I don't know if
Lots
there
of favorites
is.
then, yeah?
Yeah, if there is a favorite, but I like telling the root story because I knew my Margaret and Mama Tilly. I like because that is so typical of that time and the roots of music where it evolved from gospel music and the church because that was the foundation. So, while it's not say I can't say it's a favorite, but it's a pivotal moment for people to understand their foundation and their roots because that's where the faith, the love, and the family. And it's as I said, it started for him in the womb, listening to his family talking about. Well, there is one story that I do like. I have to say there is one story about him being a little boy at church and the preacher was making, got everybody in the church happy and his grandmother and mother and all of them were crying, just shouting in the church. But he thought the preacher was doing something to them. So he went outside and got a rock and walked up the aisle of the church and was going to hit the preacher because he was making his mama and grandmama cry. So that's a funny story. And they stopped him. He ran outside and got a rock, and he had to be like 6 or 7 years old. So
Oh,
that was
my
that was
goodness.
a funny story.
So in the course of putting the book totally together, did you need to obtain any rights? Did anybody have to sign off?
Well, just the kids.
Just the kids.
Yeah, just the kids because my sister and him, they were divorced. So the kids just gave me, the permission to do whatever with their father. And Edward Patton's wife, because I have a picture of Edward and William in there together. Edward was almost like my father. He
Mhm.
was, the two of them, I can say they saved me from a lot of punishment. They used to tell my mother, Mom, let her come with us. And, so they spoiled me a little bit. Not that I was a, mischievous child, but everybody got on punishment every now and then.
Mm.
So his wife gave me permission, for anything and everything, anything else about the group. They were through William's words, So the copacetics, that picture I got, a couple of rights, and a lot of the pictures I took myself. So Motown and stuff like that, everybody thinks it's this huge, huge building. You go up there, it's like a little house. And you can't imagine that all of that stuff went on in that little facility, but it did.
Am I right that it was called Hitsville? Was that one on
Yeah,
the?
Hitsville, right. But it is a tiny structure. But
Mm.
in that structure, they had the ladies going to charm school and learning how to walk and stuff. They had the Charlie Atkins teaching them how to dance. I mean, that culture, Barry Gordy was brilliant.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that little structure turned out some gigantic stuff.
But when they got to Buddha Records, where Buddha concentrated on just them,
Mhm.
which let them go because Barry didn't want to pay them the money that they thought that they should get at that particular time. When they got to Buddha Records, everything exploded.
Mhm.
The music awards, the Grammys, all of that stuff came about, hit after hit after hit.
Hit after lots of hits. Have you thought about writing other books about other performers?
Well, it is so funny because those four books that you mentioned, I was an academic, so those were academic stuff.
Right?
Um, Not so far. Because I was close to this one. This was a labor of love.
Sure.
People are, really after me about writing my memoir and all that stuff because I have so much stuff in it, including
Well, you
music.
should. You should write
Yeah,
your
I will, but
memoir.
I said I'm still living it. So, there's still some parts, although during the pandemic, I did sort of capture some of my story, but I also started writing more music. So I have 3 songs that I'm probably, well, I thought I was really close and shopping. So I still have that love for music. And, I don't know. This one was personal, because I lived it.
Well, it's your family. It's your
Yeah,
family.
it's my family. So I don't know if somebody came up and says, "Well, we want to contract you to write," like my methodology head and my easy ability to write and all of that stuff, and I'm a journalist. I could definitely do it.
I assume you're no longer teaching now that you're Professor Emerita, or are you still teaching?
No, I'm not teaching. I helped them write a $2 million grant where I produced 7 like mini docs for them on
Okay.
people. So, I'm still engaged, although I do workshops and stuff like that. I was my endowed chair was in ethics. I think that I really need to be out there teaching ethics now.
Oh, well, somebody needs to.
Yeah, yeah, and I've been thinking there's a citizenship institute that I may approach about that. And because of the world, that's the only thing, because I really like writing the stuff that I wasn't doing. But it's so funny. A lot of students, they call me, and my students call me Dr. Z. They said, Dr. Z, did you see that? Or did you hear that? Because that's the way I would start my class off. We would pick 3 or 4 topics and then we would just blow them up. I'm sort of happy that I'm out because I wasn't, after Professor Emerita, I was on the board of Florida Virtual School. The president died. So they talked me into being interim president for a few months. And then, the pandemic and stuff hit. So I was happy and felt blessed that I wasn't in charge of anything.
Well, I understand that because I retired from full-time teaching as the pandemic hit. It was just coincidence.
Right, me too. It was that August. And I
Yep,
was so
that's right.
happy that I wasn't in charge of anything, although I'm still on boards and stuff, because I'm still very much close to making sure that things are, happening for the right reasons.
How important do you think being a teacher for all those years was to you being able to put the book together in such a great way?
Well, a lot because I had to write a lot, but I always told my students, and because one time I had my students doing some presentations, I walked in, they were playing my song, Time Moves On. So they knew, but I would tell my students I was 75% artist, 25% academic. So my approach to things in my class, there was always different, always fun, because I always considered myself an artist, even with all the administration I did. I mean, because even, I was vice president of research. I started the distance learning instructional technology. My dissertation was the second in the country on technology and education. So I did all of those things, but again, it was an artistic approach. I don't like to do anything, the way anybody else does it or the way it was done to me or I received it. I wanted to engage students. So, to engage students, I had to use my creativity.
So I've been having the absolutely one of the most wonderful conversations I've had in a while with Lady Dhyana Ziegler about her book Midnight Train from Georgia. And we're going to wind the show down a little bit right now. So do you have a story that you can share with us that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny?
Well, I can tell you one that's weird and go as a kid. I used to play with my eyes crossed. And
What?
I used to play with my eyes crossed because I really believe, remember, I was in my head that I had a soul twin that was in another universe. And remember, I wore uniforms. If I think about it, it's like Star Trek and Catholic school. We were doing the same thing at the same time, and we were both in uniforms. So I played with my eyes crossed because I wanted to see everybody else in duo. So it was really kind of strange. I'm a Trekkie fan, and I would be and sitting in Catholic school, and my soul twin it'd be in a different environment, a different uniform, but we would be doing the same thing at the same time. So that's kind of quirky, and I probably go there a little bit now too, but not as strange.
So I've had the privilege of spending 80 minutes on stage interviewing William Shatner.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm a Trekkie. I love it. And also with Sid Author, I can think and I can meditate. I was a Herman Hesse fan and stuff.
Herman
Those
Hesse.
things that sort of gave me the foundation that it was okay to be weird.
Sure. Well, I think that that's what makes great creative people great, is that they think of themselves as not, of the norm. They're a little bit outside the norm.
Right. That's
And
right.
so I think that's fantastic stuff. So last question for you today, Lady Dhyana. You've already given us a gigantic amount of advice throughout this whole show, but I'm wondering if you can share with us a single piece of advice or a tip that you like to give those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to the next level.
Well, first of all, dream big and be bold. I always say that I got my guts from my mother and my humility from my father. If I was just the daddy's girl that I am, I would probably never go out there. But because of my mother and watching her step out and be so strong, it made me bold, that I could go out and have the guts to do and try new things. Don't be afraid to try new things, and don't be afraid to fail. Everything is not going to be perfect, but when you get in that stride and you get in that rhythm, you can hear that beat and you can dance.
Well, that is just fabulous advice, because that's the only way to do it, is to just be bold and go for it.
Right, exactly.
Lady Dhyana, this has been an absolutely wonderful hour on StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and for your wisdom.
Well, thank you. You've been a wonderful host, and I loved your questions.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.